In this video, I'm going to describe and then implement the Singleton design pattern in Java. Singleton is one of the simplest design patterns, so it won't take long to do, more than likely. It's a creational pattern, and its role is to ensure that only one object gets created from that class. We could expand this concept and say, okay, maybe only 3 are created or only 5 are created. But for very heavy objects that have a lot of attributes, or objects where we need one object that is making decisions for an entire program, Singleton works very well. So it's a simple pattern, and it has a couple of interesting nuances. First of all, it has a private constructor. Why is that? Well, remember that we create an object by invoking the constructor. And if we leave the constructor wide open, we could create as many objects as we want. But why private? Now that's weird, because remember what private means. Private means it can only be invoked from that class itself. So if a constructor is private, we have a chicken before the egg problem, right? Because only that class can invoke the constructor, but theoretically we'd need an object of that class to invoke the constructor, and to get an object of the class we'd need to invoke the constructor. You see where I'm going with this? No, actually there's a way out of that. What we'll do is have a static method called getInstance on this class. And it's a static method, which means that we can invoke it on a class without having an object, right? And because we're in that class, we do have access to all private attributes, methods, and even constructors. So you see the static getInstance method can invoke that private constructor when needed to get an object, and then return that object when needed. Now, important keyword there is when needed. Remember, we only want to create one object of this class. So what we'll do is we'll say, do we have the object yet? If so, return it. If not, call the constructor, create the object, return it, but then also store it for future use. So what I'm going to do is take an existing class I have that has only static methods and convert it to a singleton, which raises the question, what's the difference between a class with only static methods and a singleton? Well, the two concepts are actually very similar, because in both cases we're not creating a bunch of objects. With a static class, as a class with only static methods, we're creating no objects. With a singleton, we're creating one object. And it gets kind of funny there, because remember, static attribute applies to the class, which means it applies to all objects of that class. Where if we have a single object of a class and only one object, it's kind of similar, because whatever values we set on those attributes are universal, because there's only going to be one object. I think I talked myself into a circle there. I hope that makes sense. But nonetheless, with the singleton, we create one object. We have object instance variables. With the static, we create no objects. Statics have use, but we don't want to overuse them. So if you're kind of like, well, should I make a class with only static methods, or should I make a singleton? I would lean towards making a singleton. Anyway, enough talking. Let's do it. So I have my class called driver. And notice we have public static void main. Now we can't get away from this being static, because by definition public static void main is static, and that's the method that starts our whole program when we do a right-click run or however we do it. So I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and give this class a private constructor. Now it doesn't need to have anything in it, it just needs to be private. And remember the way that constructors work. We can define constructors for a class. They can have, we can define multiple if we want, by overloading them. So in other words, having different parameter lists. On the other hand, if we don't define a constructor, Java gives us one by default at compile time anyway. And it's called the default constructor because it has no parameters. And that's essentially what I've set up here, with one difference. The default constructor is typically public. By defining the constructor and making it private, I'm just saying, okay, don't give me the default constructor. I'm going to define the constructor as private, and by doing that, we don't get the default constructor, which means that no one else can come in here and start creating objects, because we've just said the only constructor that exists is going to be private. So we're good with that. Under the main method, let me go ahead and make a getInstance method. Remember that this needs to be static, and it's oftentimes public because it's usually invoked from another class that wants to get that single instance of this object. Now the return type, well, remember this is a creational pattern, so we want to return the object we're created, which in this case is driver. Now, how do we make sure that we only have one object? Well, we store it in a variable, and we'll make that a static variable as well. We'll make that up here, and a private static variable at that. If I left it like that, it would initialize to null, but to be a bit more explicit here, I'm going to go ahead and initialize it to null manually. And now we can finish up our getInstance method. There we have it. That's our Singleton. So what's going on here? Well, the first time we invoke this getInstance method, driver is going to be null because remember I just declared it as null. So this if test is going to return to true, and inside of the if test we're going to create a new driver object and save that in that driver variable. From this point forward, unless we change it manually, driver is not null. So you see this if test only runs the first time. Now after the if test runs, we return this newly created driver object. On the other hand, let's consider the second, third, fourth, fifth time we invoke this method and any time after the first. Well, driver is no longer going to be null, so you see that this if test will return false, but will still come down and return that single driver object, and that's how the Singleton works. So now let's go back up to our main method and let's invoke this getInstance method. A static method can only directly call another static method, so it's a good thing that we made getInstance static, because notice that public static void main is static. Nonetheless, let's call this driver. And now we can say driver.promptUser and driver.displayOutput. And because we're using the object reference driver to invoke these two methods no longer need to be static, and the attributes they use no longer need to be static. So in a normal Singleton, you might be starting from scratch. In this case, I'm converting an existing program, so I'm quickly just going to remove the statics from those methods that I'm invoking. You see, I also can remove static from the attributes that those methods are invoking as well. Now, let's quickly run this in the debugger. I did add one more command as well. I called getInstance a second time because I want to show how that if test behaves the second time we invoke. So go ahead and start with our first one. We do our print line. And now we're invoking getInstance. I'm going to step into this. We see driver equals null. The debugger is very helpful here, and it tells us, oh yeah, this is true. We step in, and we invoke the constructor for driver, and there's our private constructor. Goes through a bit of initialization. And now let's take a look at our driver attribute, and we see that it is no longer null. It now has values in it, right? It's been instantiated. So we go back now to the main method that invoked this. Now I have this dummy method. There's dummy method call. There's nothing I'm doing with this driver2 variable. I just want to show how the Singleton works. So we step in this time. Now look at this. You see a little different behavior here. Driver is no longer null. That's going to evaluate to false. I step over. The if test is skipped altogether. And what does it return? It returns that very same driver that we created previously. And that essentially is a Singleton. So, as always, I hope you found this video helpful, and I look forward to reading your comments. Thank you.